Okay. Stephen.
Okay. Hello. My name's Stephen Kahn. I'm the editor and co-founder of The Conversation, which exists to channel academic knowledge and views and thoughts to a non-academic readership and listenership. And we are one of the biggest relayers of academic knowledge around the world now. We've been going for about 15 years, and I'm delighted that we are a partner of this event. We have been for a couple of years now, and yeah, I'm very much looking forward to meeting you all in person in Siena. And I think I'm assuming we'll go around and do introductions around the screen. Is that right, Francesco?
Okay, yes, Francesco, yes. Steve, thank you so much. You double thank you because this is the first webinar that will frame the so-called problem solving groups of the conference. Probably the most creative part of the Siena Conference of the Europe of the Future. Creativity sometimes sort of is close to a little bit of chaos, but we will manage it. Today we have we will discuss the first, I would say, rather preliminary paper that Simone with Jacopo start drafting for further elaborating in the next weeks. We deliberately decided to have a rather general approach to the question of how regulation should be reconsidered. So not only regulation within the so-called very wide Green Deal, but the probably not less wide digital. And so that the final outcome of the regulation is possibly less harm if there is a trade-off between regulation and innovation, which I doubt, on European companies, but also more capability to protect the rights of citizens and firms for which regulation was initially considered. So it's rather wide, and I would leave it to Simone and Jacopo. Thank you.
Thank you, Francesco. So I'm Simone Borghesi. I'm the director of the climate area at the Florence School of Regulation in the European University Institute. And today with me I have Jacopo Cammeo and Alessia Casamassima, both from my team at EUI. Francesco asked me to be involved in this challenging topic, I would say, because the relationship between regulation and innovation is certainly one of the most long-standing debates in the literature. But here we are not talking about literature only. We want to discuss what is the relationship in daily life, I would say. And this is a very timely topic nowadays. So to go straight to the point, I would say that at least when I read the topic, I thought, well, there is not a trade-off between regulation and innovation. And if I look at the economic literature, I think this trade-off has been shown basically non-existent. But I also know that there is no unanimous agreement on this. And so I could say that there are two sides, two conflicting opinions on whether there is or there isn't a a conflict between regulation and innovation, a trade-off between regulation and innovation. On the one hand, there is the neoclassical view that considers regulation as a burden, as a cost, and so as such reducing the capacity of innovation of firms and their profitability. On the other hand, there is in the environmental economics literature, the so-called Porter hypothesis, arguing that regulation actually spurs innovation and can also lead to higher productivity, higher competitiveness, higher profits. So empirical evidence has shown that the so-called weak version of the Porter hypothesis, namely more regulation, more innovation, is confirmed by the data. Whereas the strong version, namely more regulation, more profits at the end of the day, is not clearly confirmed. And there is really room for larger debate. But this is the literature. Let me focus for a while on the daily reality. I think there is a distinction between what the literature tells us and what people perceived. So nowadays, I think there a perceived trade-off between regulation and innovation. There is a widespread feeling that regulation or excessive regulation is actually hindering innovation. And I think this perception has also influenced the European Commission or the European institutions, leading them to an attempt to modify the regulations in order to simplify them. I think that the omnibus package is part of this new trend that looks for simplification of the regulations to spur innovation. And more recently, this debate has shifted or has focused even more on the environmental aspects, particularly on one kind of regulation, the one of the EU ETS, which is a rather complex but also crucial environmental regulation, being the pillar, I would say, of the European climate policy. And from the focus on the EU ETS, then it has also passed on to discuss whether to simplify, change, or even stop, I would say, some other regulations like the CBAM. So from regulation to simplification, from simplification to suspension in some cases, this is what some parties or governments have claimed for. At FSR, we work extensively on the EU ETS, we work extensively on the CBAM. So our name, FSR, stands for Florence School of Regulation. So maybe we are biased in favor of regulation, but certainly in favor of a good regulation that manages to spur innovation, does not overburden the firms and the citizens. I will stop here, give the floor now to Alessia to introduce the questions that we try to reflect upon.
Sorry. Hello, nice to meet you. I'm Alessia Casamassima. I'm a research associate at the Florence School of Regulation, which is part of the European University Institute, and I currently work with Simona. And so let me introduce the discussion of this workshop. So basically, first of all, this is a very timely issue. I totally agree with Simona. So if we consider the 2024 Draghi report on Europe's competitiveness strategy, it clearly highlights the structural challenges faced by European industry and firms within the single market. And one of the key debates that follow concerns the real causes of Europe's lag compared to the United States and China. And a recurring argument in this discussion is that excessive regulatory production in Europe may reduce competitiveness. And if we compare, for instance, the legislative output of the United States and the European Union between 2019 and 2024, the US adopted around 3,050 legislative acts, while the EU adopted approximately 13,000 legislative acts. However, I believe that the core issue is not only the volume of regulation, but also what Simone rightly pointed out. So the way these measures are perceived by the public. So I think that a central factor is the complexity of Europe's multi-level governance system. So because maintaining coordination across 27 member states without a fully centralized authority, of course, leads to overlaps between EU and national regulation, which can, of course, generate uncertainty for both citizens and businesses. And this is also consistent with findings from a study that we conducted at FSR with Simone within the Capable project completed last December, in which basically we analyzed perception of the Green Deal and the Just Transition mechanism through interviews with European policymakers, politicians, and trade unions. And one of the key findings was that many stakeholders perceive these policies as insufficiently adapted to the specific economic and social conditions of different countries. And as a result, of course, they often expressed limited confidence in their effectiveness and feasibility. And so these results also show that perception plays a crucial role in determining the actual impact of EU regulation. And for this reason, it's also important to improve not only the design, but also the communication of policies. So in fact, also through on our ongoing project at FSR called NETS, we are working on identifying effective communication strategies to improve awareness and public understanding of ETS2. However, so for this discussion, there are four key issues underpinning today's workshop. So the first point is rethinking EU regulation for innovation and energy autonomy. So in this regard, reducing fragmentation and regulatory complexity would make the system more transparent, lower compliance burdens, and improve its practical impact. The second point is to mobilize consumers as drivers of innovation. So basically, consumer can be used as a force to steer innovation by shifting regulation from controlling firms' internal processes to focusing on measurable outcomes, prioritizing in this way the actual results, such as the environmental or carbon footprint of produced products and services. And this would make performance more transparent and comparable, allowing consumers to reward better outcomes through their choices and indirectly push firms toward innovation. The other point is to design an effective industrial policy. So in this case, European firms need to be flexible and continuously adaptive. So rather than relying on fixed category and static regulatory taxonomies, policy should be regularly assessed based on whether it achieves its objective and how it affects innovation in practice. And then the last point is to improve regulatory effectiveness. So a way to reduce legislative effort while improving outcomes is to shift part of the system from obligation and penalties to incentives. So instead of focusing only on pushing non-compliance, regulation could more strongly identify and reward firms that adopt desirable behaviors that consumers can recognize and prefer. So this is the basically the sum of the paper of Simone and Jacopo. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Alessia. Over to you, Francesco.
No, it's a very, very interesting and innovative, as you know, Simone. Flexibility, people, it's very interesting. I would leave it to Stephen as for Nicola, who is very much on regulation for digital, and then Simone, who is very much on regulation for green. Stephen, you.
I don't really have comments as such at this stage, Francesco. I'm kind of listening and learning and trying to absorb as much as I can of the background to these discussions to be able to hopefully guide them when we arrive in Siena. So I think Nicola, over to you. You'll be able to add much more to this discussion than I can.
I'm not sure I have, Stephen, in the sense that I'm not an expert in regulation. I'm a practitioner in the digital space, right? I spent the last 30 years working for technology corporations, 20 years at Cisco, 2 years at IBM, and now 9 years at MasterCard. And I've been basically the recipient, right, of those changes. And my first reaction to the question that was posed, Alessia, is this really trade-off or not? Or are there ways in which, if we regulate in a smart way, understanding the consequences, sometimes the unintended ones of this regulation, we could actually create innovation. And the classic example that I've seen myself as a recipient is open banking and PSD2 in Europe, right? So a set of regulations that were supposed to protect the consumers and help them port their data from bank to bank, once implemented, unleashed an enormous amount of innovation in the fintech space, for which companies like Adyen or so in the PSP, the payment facilitators, or neobanks like Revolut spin off that phenomenon, right? So to me, that's I'm not sure in the financial and payment space I've seen the trade-off. I've more seen regulations which was not necessarily only focused at the consumer protection, which is fair, but also the interoperability of different systems, and then unleashes investments in a whole new market, right? And so that's my only practitioner view there. Again, I'm not an expert. And so the question to me in the energy space, thinking loud, is there an equivalent, right, for the energy sector to what we've seen in the financial and payment sector through PSD2 and through open banking? And I know if there is one, right, and if it's doable, but my experience again is hand-on and bottom-up from that perspective. And there, Europe leads, right? The largest neobank or fintech in the world is actually in Europe, right? Which is Revolut, right? So that's a bit my perspective, Stephen. Is more the business bottom-up, if I may.
I'd be interested to know from the Florence School people to what degree they see similarities between the different sectors and the responses to regulation. Do you see patterns, or do you see very different reactions to the prospect of increased regulation, reducing regulation?
Well, in this case, it's me to say I'm not an expert because we are so much specializing in our own sector, then we lose sight of what's next, what's near. And in a way, this is the great merit of Francesco, that really pushes us, compels us to look beyond our small garden and what is happening around us. And my feeling, it's more a gut feeling than an expert opinion, is that there are strong similarities between what Nicola was saying for digital and what we perceive or see in energy and climate, say, which is my sector. And when you started saying, I don't see a trade-off, I was, quite happy to hear that, Nicola, because I don't think there is a trade-off either. The point is the way it is communicated outside. This sounds like a real trade-off, at least in an energy and climate context. The more so in the last few weeks and months, obviously also because of the geopolitical situation that is, pushing strongly towards the negative aspects in all respects, and so particularly for the energy and climate sphere. If I may, I know that he will hate me, but let me change hat for a second, because I started to say I'm the director of FSR Climate, which is true. But here in this meeting, I'm also as vice rector at the University of Siena. And at the University of Siena, we have led a project looking at how stakeholders perceived the regulation and using text-based analysis to be more objective on this. And since Riccardo is here, Riccardo, don't hate me, but if I push the spot on you now, but maybe you have something to say more on this aspect based on, how can I say, objective evidence that comes from text-based analysis.
Yes, thank you, Simone. As Simone said, I worked with him in Siena on a project on stakeholder perceived effect of some kind of policy, in particular the EU ETS and the reforms of the EU ETS. And I think I also was thinking the same when you said about the similarities between different sectors, about also what Nicola was saying, because the ETS is certainly a big push for innovation coming from regulation, and it has been a big push for innovation for more than 20 years now. So it's very important in this kind of example. Regarding our own research work, I think that the most interesting thing about this discussion that we're having, that we found, is that maybe the most important thing for stakeholders is not the amount of regulation, is not the complexity of regulation, but is the certainty of regulation. So the fact that a regulatory instrument may be perceived by those that have to stand in it as something that will stand in time, that will not change in 2 or 3 years, and this creates investment certainty. It creates incentives for industry and for stakeholders to innovate. But it is a challenge, because especially in some topics such as, for example, digital or AI, regulation may be already outdated as soon as they come out, as soon as they're implemented.
Exactly.
So I think that the big issue here is to find this balance, and flexibility may be one of the biggest improvements in this kind of developing of policies. And I think this may be a central aspect of this webinar as well. I hope I was clear, but I don't want to go too much into the specifics of the research, the message that comes out of it.
Stephen, we have Simone now. Simone is a proper expert of regulation on Green Deal. Simone, are you there?
Simone Moi, that's me.
Yes, you're working. Yeah.
Guys, unfortunately, good evening, everyone. Thank you very much for the invitation. It's a very complicated day. I just landed. I'm in a overcrowded airport, and then I couldn't follow the first part of the discussion. So it's maybe Francesco, it's better if I just wait for another couple of discussion to understand a bit better the context, because otherwise to be
Okay.
Not very much in tune with what you are discussing.
I mean,
Okay.
it's
Yeah,
very.
Hello?
Sorry, Francesco.
No, it's okay. It's okay. Thanks. Stephen.
I was just going to say that it's very broad at this point, and I think we're exploring how various forms of regulation impact upon different sectors, and we've touched a little bit on fintech, energy and environment, and then just fleetingly there, Riccardo, on tech more broadly, which I think's fascinating, particularly in light of the incredibly rapid developments around large language models. And I guess to that point, I'm really eager to come back to the environmental side of this, but I'd really be keen to hear people's thoughts on, I guess, the sort of implications of GDPR and the sort of lessons learned from that, which I guess there was an awful lot of skepticism, probably particularly outside the European Union, when that regulation came into force, and yet has now been world leading and sort of redefined the way that we engage digitally and the digital economy. So really eager to hear people's thoughts on that and what the legacy of that is.
Jacopo?
Hello. Hi, everyone. I'm Jacopo Cammè. I'm a researcher at the European University Institute. I wanted to make a point that can link several things already discussed, and that's a quick one. The importance to communicate the strong and stable, as Riccardo said, and complex regulation at the European level in both the digital and environmental contexts. I think it is maybe more valid for the digital one, but also for the environment, is that such kind of regulation is necessary to guarantee, to make sure that most of the people will take advantage of the innovation. Otherwise, with the weak regulation, and so I agree that I don't see a trade-off, but with a weak regulation, it could happen that, like what is happening in the United States, with, as Alessia said, a lower number of sets of regulationary sets. It's possible that a small group of people is taking the lead and taking the advantage of the innovation outcomes. And so I think that it's a quite strong political message, but it's not really, positioned on the right or the left, but it's something important. So again, saying that there is not a trade-off and that the strong regulation is maybe as a leverage to go to fair innovation. That was my thought, just as a brainstorming.
Nicola?
Can I maybe have again, back from my perspective, a comment there on GDPR, right? When that was introduced, I was at IBM, right? And of course, the first reaction, this is, I think, quite known, was, okay, how do we deal with that? Almost, how do we resist? And this is the usual reaction from the business side. But then, interesting enough, what IBM did with my next employer, which was MasterCard, is to basically create a company who sits in Ireland called Troata, who started to develop business out of the GDPR. So IBM and MasterCard came together and said, okay, how do we GDPR enable all our data on top of which we see the payment data from MasterCard, the overall business data. And so they started to run it through this engine that this company created. And then we realized, that when I was at MasterCard, that this could become a business. So we started to become providers of these capabilities to both IBM and or MasterCard clients. And so this was turned into a business. My observation, and it's quite anecdotal, so please take it with a huge grain of salt, is that, and my question was, why did two technology corporations from the US do that? Why wasn't the European technology sector or non-technology sector reacting to that and say, okay, instead of looking at this as policy only, let's look into this as a market-making opportunity to create new services, right? And in fact, this is what happened again with open banking. Open banking created opportunities, in this case, for European companies and European investments and capital to be invested there to create unicorns even, right? So I think that's maybe the question that I still struggle with. So is this a lack of perspective, leadership, ambition by the European private sector versus the US one? And why do the European corporations, and I'm generalizing here, struggle to fill in the gap between policy and sales? So you either look at the government as a policymaker and you try to resist, or you look at government as a client. But that in between space, when the government becomes a market maker, even through regulatory sandbox and policies, is quite unoccupied by the Europeans, in my observation, and is heavily occupied by the US company. And the Chinese companies are starting to move into the space as well. Why is that? Is actually the question that I can't find an answer. And maybe that's part of a conversation that we could take forward.
It's very interesting. I mean, I think you sort of tend to find that there's incredible resistance to any form of regulation in the US and other parts of the world. But the stereotype is that sort of US, particularly tech and finance business, would forcefully resist regulation in any way, and yet it's then quite dynamic to take advantage of the creation of new markets, as you suggest.
Interestingly, Stephen, these companies, and I'm generalizing, yes, they will resist regulation in their domestic markets. But when they play on foreign international markets, and they are maybe not incumbents, they develop, I've seen literally banks acting in very different ways, whether they are on their own domestic origin market or whether they play abroad. Play abroad, they will embrace regulation and use it to innovate. That will rarely transpire back into their own country. So it's also, I guess, a function of your position in the market, right? From a private perspective, whether you think you are a challenger or an incumbent. And if you're a challenger, your mindset is already much more open and much more innovative. And that's at least my observation from within that world.
Stephen, can I say something rather quickly? By the way, we have among our spectators also Ginevra Bruzzone, who probably may want to say something. Quite few very competent quote-unquote regulators. Now, I must say that from the point of view of somebody who is supposed to be an economist, quote-unquote economist, I always found myself rather uncomfortable with this idea of regulation as a sort of predefined given quantity of which we want to estimate the impact of on firms or people. To me, this is absolutely crap. There are regulations that can have a positive impact on these people, firms, citizens. Regulation that can be a disaster. Let me give you just 3 examples, Nicola. You are right. There are regulations that have been a business opportunity for actually not European firms, like the GDPR. There have been regulation, or probably more precisely standards, that actually were used to create a huge competitive advantage in the 90s. I'm now thinking about the GSM, the standard for making Nokia and Ericsson absolutely world leader in mobile phones. And there are regulations that, quite honestly, Simone, you may think very differently on that, but corporate sustainability directives, quite honest, I don't see them to be never able to do that much good to European firms, because they were very much on process, not on results and blah, blah, blah. So my point is, could we talk about regulation as a quantity? There is an approach to distinguish better regulation from very bad regulation. Simone, I don't know if you want to jump into discussion now.
No, yes,
Without making.
Again, I apologize. I'm not a perfect condition to interact with you, but I follow you. I switch off the video just not to make you sick.
I've lost him.
Simone, I hope he didn't make some car accident in the middle. Okay.
Can I maybe comment on Francesco, on the GSM mentioning that you made? As you recall, I wrote my thesis about that in industrial economy. And I think one of the outcome of the regulation of the GSM through
already
the work
quite
that
overregulated because a large part of the impact was in the energy market, and the integration and the coherence between what the basic of the market regulation was trying to achieve, so basically competition and technological innovation, was somewhat conflicting with the mid to long term targets in the climate policies. I remember pretty well. I'm old enough to remember pretty well the big discussion. Somebody before me mentioned the ETS, for example. I remember pretty well when after the ETS introduction, there was a huge debate, for example, in Brussels, if we could just let the market go. So, the market, the energy market dynamics, competition, unbundling, etc., while utilizing a unique target of decarbonization and then utilizing the ETS for the value that ETS may provide, so keeping technological neutrality and letting on the back of players to make a good allocation of choices. Europe gave up very soon and started to integrate into the market an enormous amount of targets and sub-targets and detailed regulation. I'm not able to say if this was unavoidable or was a good choice or not. But if you look at, I tend to be on the side of pessimistic. If you look at the outcome of all this set of regulation, what we have today is a market which integrates some difficulties into the overall scheme of decarbonization processes and technology. We see basically a pretty broad range of failures when dealing with the ability to implement our own technology in Europe, because a large part of technologies have been imports. And unfortunately, this is not strictly related to regulation, but finally it is a lack of political support to what Brussels is proposing in this sector. So, I mean, if you put all that together, probably there is some deep criticism to be made. And in my experience, Brussels institutions are very reluctant to try to give ex post accountability. As you know, Francesco, we worked on a book focusing a large part on ETS. It's quite incredible that it's probably the most ambitious and complicated measure put in place at the Brussels level. And believe me, the level of accountability on the real effect of ETS on investment, disinvestment, decarbonization. I mean, through some kind of cause-effect factual analysis is very poor. Despite the fact that Bas has claimed that ETS has been a cornerstone of many results in terms of reduction of emissions, but again, the link, the causality link is very weak, and despite the industrial sector believes that ETS has been one of the key vector of the industrialization, and in this case, the connection is even weaker. So, I mean, I would say that having followed all the process, probably there is we understood, and probably Francesco, you were together with me and trying to understand the right direction, because actually many of the proposals went to the right direction. But if you have to evaluate from the final effect, the final impact into the market, probably I would buy quite a large position of the most skeptical people, in the sense that the results are not evident, the political support is weak, and the overall utilization of public resources to promote technology or solution has been in many cases not completely efficient, and when it has been efficient, such as in the case of renewables after the first wave, not able to support the development of an European industrial technological leadership. So I don't want to be too pessimistic, but that's I would say if you shoot today, there are not many reasons to be happy.
As you can tell, I'm under some pressure to move to another meeting, but I guess I can follow up with you, Francesco, directly, and others afterwards. But I guess one sort of overriding question, and again primarily to you, Francesco, would be there's lots of fascinating information already, albeit from slightly different spheres. Loads of great experience from different areas. How do we channel this into the kind of paper that you envisage coming out of this in Siena?
Yeah, unless there are other big comments, I would to answer your question also, because you are very much pushed to go to your other meeting with your kid. I personally would very much like to go back to the 3 points that Alessia was making. I share them in a very big way. We talked about this, Simone, as polar stars of some change in the overall approach that we have to regulation. I would say probably personally, I think that the most convincing and probably innovative is this idea that regulation should be made so that more people understand them. Some of them are really very opaque, like even the emission trading system. Now, as we commented, Simone, although probably emission trading system is still a regulation that had some impact, but this idea of using the energy of people is very interesting. It's very interesting. Of people and firms, whose rights we want to defend. Number two, the flexibility in regulation. Riccardo, you are very, very, very right that the regulation should be stable. Otherwise, there is no certainty for investment. And yet, especially you mentioned AI. On AI, even Dario Amodei knows where are we hitting. No, So to have something like the Artificial Intelligence Act of 101 articles is almost a suicide. It's like you are trying to regulate with a massive act of regulation, something that you cannot even make sense of, no? So in that, you certainly need some flexibility. I would argue that this flexibility, however, again, this is a very personal idea, should be somehow, the regulation of regulation should come from some technical authority, not from directly politicians. So you should have an assessment on some indicators, whether the regulation is working or not working. One idea would be even to count how many people understood the regulation and used that regulation, going back to the question of citizen, no? That could be quite interesting. And number three, going from regulating the process, as in the corporate sustainability directives, of which, again, I'm not an expert. Simone, you are the expert. Unfortunately, today we did not have our friend Kurt van den Derde from OECD, but they are very much pioneering this system by which firms are measured for their footprint on the results and not on the process. So this is also something that we may think about. Stephen must go, but in terms of the result of this problem solving, probably there could be some suggestion that I personally would give. Simone, what do you think?
Simone, myself, or Simone?
Simone, yourself.
The other.
No, but you are the master. Simone will help.
Okay. No, well, just to say that there is a lot of food for thought from this meeting. I already see conflicting opinions, and I look forward to continue this conversation in Siena, to be honest. But I agree with you, Francesco, that we can take this as a polar star for what we want to convey. These are the elements which will probably lead to some convergence among different opinions that we may have on the UTS or other issues. But certainly some degree of simplification and getting closer to people to get higher public acceptance, I think it's something that we all agree upon.
Well, it's already a result.
Exactly.
I'm very happy about it. Simone, the other Simone, thanks to you and to everybody. We already left Stephen and Nicola. We'll see you, Alessia, Jacopo, and Riccardo in Siena. I hope we will be able to see also Ginevra and Monica, who are among our spectators here. And it's 7 o'clock, Friday night, so I think you already did your big part. So thanks a lot. Grazie.
Thank you, Francesco. Ciao.
Grazie.
Ciao.
Ciao.
Ciao.